Good afternoon. On behalf of us all here at the Little Museum, you are very welcome to this talk as part of the Outing the Past Festival. Thank you so much for joining us. This talk is titled Outing the Past, Waking the Hirschfeld. And I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers, Maria Pramaggiore, Professor of Film and Media Studies at Maynooth University, and Pádraig Kerrigan, Assistant Professor, School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. If you have any questions for our speakers, please type them into the chat function and we will take some time to discuss them at the end. For now, thank you again for joining us. Pádraig, Maria, over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And we are really happy to collaborate with the Little Museum of Dublin on this Outing the Past Festival program. And we're particularly happy to put the word out there, I suppose, on our project we've been kind of cultivating and sculpting over the last number of years, Waking the Hirschfeld, an oral history and archival study of Dublin's Hirschfeld Centre, a project that has been at the heart of myself and Maria's research for the past number of years, an institution that has fascinated us, that has intrigued us, and I suppose a pink rabbit that we've chased through the archives to try and just find out more about how this institution has become so significant for queer activism on the island of Ireland and globally across Europe and the world. So I suppose this is the start of our journey in terms of actually getting into the nitty-gritty with the data and speaking to people. So we're very happy to launch it today with you all. So Maria, I will hand it over to you for why Waking the Hirschfeld and the title's dual meaning.
Thank you very much, Pádraig, and thank you to the Little Museum for inviting us to speak about this research today. I'm very conscious of how binary we are in this presentation and in this project. There's Pádraig and myself. There's the oral history and archival study, the two parts to the project. And also even the title to us, Waking the Hirschfeld, has a dual meaning. So apologies to those among us who are non-binary, because I certainly respect that perspective. For us, the title does have at least two meanings, and that is that we want to awaken the history of the Hirschfeld Centre, of queer Dublin, of queer Ireland, of queerness in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, through a historical study, also through people's memories. We plan to interview people who founded the Hirschfeld Centre in the late 70s, people who worked on staff, people who enjoyed the disco, people who availed of the services that the Hirschfeld offered. We do plan to comb physical archives as well as digital archives, including the Irish Queer Archive. And our interest is to look at the activism and community building that took place in and around and out of the Hirschfeld in relation to LGBTQ history in Ireland and elsewhere. Afterward, who learned how to become political activists through the Hirschfeld and carried that on, for example. And we've been noting that the Hirschfeld appears more and more in popular culture, in Graham Norton's novel Homestretch and Philip McMahon's play Once Before I Go, which Pádraig and I got to see last fall. It's also being studied academically, for example, in Pat McDonough's recent book on LGBTQ activism. So we are in line, I suppose, with people looking back at a place that only existed for about 10 years and yet holds a very important place in history. And so to the second meaning that we're interested in is to wake an institution with a very complex history. It's a sort of theoretical idea in queer studies that queer archives have a very peculiar, unique, different approach than or existence than many archives, and it's often called ephemeral. As you can imagine, for the centuries and certainly recent decades when to be queer was dangerous and to be in the closet was your only safety, your history takes a very different, it looks very different. People are not openly out producing stories, events, acts, and history. And so the Queer Archive has lots of question marks there about what can, how we put together our history. There are also understood to be great discontinuities, partly because of that very question of the closet and suppression, that there are times of openness and times of repression, but also very, very particularly and specifically, and certainly relevant to our project because the timing of it, the Hirschfeld Center's existence in the late 70s into the late 80s, is the loss of human life, the loss of history, the loss of memory because of the AIDS epidemic and then pandemic. So we see this project, as I said, the wake has a multifaceted meaning. Back to you, Porrick.
Well, from the wake having a multifaceted meaning, the Hirschfeld itself as an institution had varying different multifaceted functions that go beyond, I suppose, the binary of our wake. And these functions encompassed, sociocultural, political, and media ones, in which the community itself, throughout the 70s and the late 80s and the late 70s and early 1980s even, attempted to cultivate some form of queer Irish culture in the name of indexing the fact that there was a community in existence for local Irish queers, that there was a community that they could reach out to, that there were services there for them, that there was queer family and queer space for them if they needed it and sought it out. So, and kind of thinking of that in the Hirschfeld's function, it's kind of the one story that always kind of comes back to myself and Maria in thinking about the multifacetedness of this. We've spoken to people that use the center regularly. They went to the Flickers disco every weekend, but also we were particularly interested in the story of the young gay guy or the young gay girl coming from, Clare Morris in Mayo and getting the bus to Dublin for that one night a week to have their moment in space, and that, I suppose, elapsing of time for a few hours for the Flickers disco before they had to get the bus back home the next morning. And I suppose it was those multifaceted stories, the multifunction that the Hirschfeld had, the meaning it had for people was varied and different. So that kind of speaks to the fact that we want to uncover how this was a multi-layered site of activity. And in that, the centre provided cohesion. It didn't just create queer Irish culture, but it created a centralized node and a centralized space where this kind of culture could cultivate. And it did this through the likes of the Hirschfeld Biograph, which was a 40-tiered cinema-seated theatre, a space where the likes of Vito Russo, an American scholar, activist, and media producer, who came over and demonstrated and showed his production, The Celluloid Closet. So very big names came into this space that brought a form of globalization to queer Irish culture that was really crucial at the time. And that's a really central part of the multi-layered activities within the Hirschfeld. There was a very cognitive attempt to reach out beyond just national borders in Ireland and to, I suppose, participate in a queer global community. Quite crucially, much of the queer press that we actually have today, particularly GCN, they were all founded within the queer space of the Hirschfeld. You had the likes of the NGF News in the very early days of the history of the queer Irish press being produced by the NGF within the Hirschfeld. You then had Out magazine, where many of its participants, Nell McCafferty, Tony Walsh, they all walked through the rooms and the walls of the Hirschfeld, and along with its editor and editorial board, Edmund Lynch, Morris Devlin, they cultivated this first commercial magazine from within the Hirschfeld. And then, of course, Ireland's longest running publication, Gay Community News, Catherine Glendon and Tony Walsh founded it in 1989. And that actually functioned from the shell of the Hirschfeld after the fire, well up until the mid-1990s, in very dangerous conditions, can I add. So even after the fire, the Hirschfeld still has a spectral presence, as it were, in queer Irish culture. So we see a media space begins to cultivate here. And not only that, RTE, the powers that be in terms of central media bodies, begin to actually come into this space to kind of go, well, what's going on here? So you see lots of press coverage begin to happen. You see lots of columns in red tops beginning to cover the Hirschfeld, and also RTE begins to actually give it airtime. So you actually see visibility begin to increase because of this cohesion happening within queer Irish culture. At a very pragmatic level, for activism, you actually need, the nuts and bolts, space, pens, paper, phone lines. It's not sexy, but it has to happen. And the Hirschfeld also provided the shell for that. So office and administrative space were provided for queer activist groups like the National Gay Federation, the Liberation for Irish Lesbians, the NGF Youth Group, and even Parents Inquiry, founded by Phil Moore. So lots of activist groupings found a space where they could reach out to particular parts of the community, and particular parts of the community had gateways in. And it's quite crucial, while some people were served by the Hirschfeld, others weren't. Now that's something that myself and Maria will get to in a few minutes' time. And it's an important part of the story as well. The gay switchboard, the LGBT helpline, the national helpline was within the Hirschfeld. And then also AIDS activism and information production all occurred through this institution, through the likes of Gay Health Action. They produced the first AIDS information leaflet on that. We had the hosting of international events. So as I said earlier, the Hirschfeld was very cognizant and conscious of participating in a queer global culture. The 1982 European Gay Youth Congress was symptomatic of that. And it was symptomatic of varying different activities, such as bringing over professors of HIV and AIDS from the US in the 1980s to come and speak to audiences in the Hirschfeld about, public health information regarding prevention of AIDS and HIV. And then I suppose what the Hirschfeld is most memorable for in terms of its popular culture imaginary, which Philip McMahon's play Once Before I Go and Graham Norton's Holding attest to, was as a site of socialization and dancing, a place where you could kiss somebody, a place where you could actually meet and have a point of connection with somebody that was just like you or not. So we had flickers and you had the cafe as well. So just in terms of representing the multifacetedness of and the multi-layered activities that occurred in Hirschfeld, we just want to demonstrate one of the clips from the archives that we want to look at and to give you a flavor of what the Hirschfeld was like. So just give me a moment to flick through my tabs, and forgive the tabs. We were just chatting about this beforehand and it gave
very revealing, Porrick.
it gave a few people some anxiety. So here is our clip. Maria, can you just confirm you can see that on your end?
I can.
Perfect, thank you.
Sound is good.
Seven 10608. Tell a friend. Yes. Yeah. Are you in for a pub? There's a lot of people in the background. Can you talk? Yeah. Yeah. My name is Mark. Maybe we could sort of work on first name terms. Just could you read me your first name, please? Fine. Okay. What seems to be? How do you feel about yourself? Yes, and
so it's a difference.
do you think you're gay?
Of some of the casting, we've got to put out all our information.
Yeah, the reason I think it's marginal. That may appear very big, but in fact, the number of mailings that go to these kind of extraordinary and remote places is not that great. So I think you'd actually need to break it down item by item.
David, it is broken down item by item. I think that's what you need to.
I think it would have to be a very convincing case, because as I say, we've already told them we can't go ahead because it's a question of finance. That's very sophisticated.
Carl, what's the nub of the problem? Just how difficult was it for that person to make the phone call?
Well, it's hard to understand, but I remember from my own experience that it was exceptionally difficult for him. It's the first time probably he's ever talked to anybody about his sexuality or his homosexuality. And that's the part that's the most frightening, is to come to accept it in yourself.
Now, what is the problem, actually?
Well, I suppose basically it's because we've been brought up to believe that we've all got to be normal, and normal in the inverted commas term, so that if we do anything that's slightly abnormal, there's something wrong with us.
Well, having made that phone call, is there suddenly a change of life?
There won't be a sudden change of life, no. That's something that we've got to come to terms with as telephone answerers, because we do tend to try and solve the problem where it's just impossible to solve. But it's something that we hope they'll be able to come more to terms with it.
I think the spinning lights and the spinning dancing is a good place to stop this. So just to kind of a few points on that actual clip, and I'll pass back over to Maria. So usually the dance floor of Flickers would absolutely be thronged every weekend, and it would be jam-packed out of it on a regular night. But obviously the community informed the the patrons that on this evening RTE would be in shooting, and if you are not comfortable being seen on camera, then don't come between, you know, this hour. And, you know, in a dance floor that would be, you know, packed with hundreds, only had 10 to 20 there. And that's reflective, I suppose, of the climate as it was at the time. You know, you had criminalization, you had widespread societal homophobia, you had queer bashing on the streets, you had the Gardaí that were actively targeting the community. So there was a climate of criminality and a culture of fear, and stigmatized fear with regards to homophobia and queer sexualities more broadly. Just to kind of briefly say, you know, the archival material with regards to Hirschfeld is relatively difficult to find because it's so spread out, and because the archive itself was destroyed in a fire. And Maria is going to speak about this in a few moments' time. So Maria, over to you for our aims then.
All right, thank you. Every time I watch that clip, I think about how exciting it must have been for the people there dancing, and also how brave they were to be doing that, for all the reasons that Porrick has just elaborated. The aims of the project are both historical and theoretical, and I get all into academies when I say what we're trying to do is theorize the history and historicize the theory, but I will say what I mean about that, and use as an example, you know, the very naming of the Hirschfeld Center. As Porrick has pointed to, we see many actions and gestures and aspirations and hopes amongst the community in and around the Hirschfeld Center at the time to reach towards international and global solidarity. And one of the things we're seeing is even in the naming of the center, it is named after the world-renowned sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who was German and who was operating in a way that was very open and affirming of a range of queer sexualities, although they wouldn't have certainly been called that at the time in the 20s and the 30s. He may be best known now because he was depicted in the television series Transparent. But anyway, a very important figure in queer history, a very important figure that the Irish people who created the Hirschfeld Center were aware of. And in our research, we've discovered that Dublin had a Hirschfeld Center before there was a Hirschfeld Center in Germany itself. And so to actually think about theorizing that history, you know, why was it? What does it say about Irish queer culture that act of solidarity and that act of sort of outward reach and a kind of sense of global community was already there at the very beginning? And then also to think about queer theory and to historicize it in relation to this time, and to sort of look at Irish examples and the Irish experience as both related to what has been discussed and theorized in queer theory, and then also different from. So those are some of the questions we're asking. We will historically be looking to document what happened at the Hirschfeld Center and what was its role as an incubator for LGBTQ political activism and queer culture. So a very sort of historicist approach. Obviously, this will be partly through the oral histories, but also from this theoretical perspective to acknowledge these inherent discontinuities in history, that history is not linear and progressive. That's part of Irish history, that's part of queer history. And so we will be contextualizing the place of the Hirschfeld in this larger queer archive that is always marked by memory loss and just the passage of time, as all history. Back to you, Porrick.
Perfect. So that brings us to our methods then, in terms of how it is we want to actually go about doing this project. So when dealing with memory, when dealing with archives, particularly of an institution that had developed an archive themselves, but then much of the material became destroyed in the fire, it's very difficult. So what we're dealing with here is very much ephemeral plastic memories. You know, they're very flexible. You know, forgetting and remembering are very intrinsic acts of ephemera. So one of the first main arms, I suppose, of the project is that we're looking to do oral histories with people who visited the Hirschfeld. And this encompasses any number of people and any kind of wide range of people that had any form of interaction with the Hirschfeld. So obviously we want to do interviews, and we plan on doing interviews with the founders themselves, the people who were, that actually founded the organization, Hirschfeld Enterprises Limited, that were part of the NGF that ran the administrative arms to the center. Quite crucially, we want to actually speak to the other side of that then, on the other side of the activism and on the other side of the administration, the visitors and the patrons that went into the coffee shop to come out to their family. I've spoken to a number of people that actually brought friends and family to the cafe in the Hirschfeld and say, do you know where we are? Well, we're actually in the Hirschfeld Center. This is actually an LGBT space or a gay space, and I'm actually gay. So it served as a really interesting means by which people materialized aspects and articulated aspects of their identity and reach out to others. So we also want to look at guests. So perhaps people that may not necessarily have been, lesbian or gay or trans or bisexual, but went alongside with their friends because the Hirschfeld at the time, Flickers, had the best disco in town. And a survey of any of the archival materials, the Irish Times and the Independent. And Pat McDonough has actually done some good work on this in his chapter 2 of his book, where he demonstrates quite clearly that the Hirschfeld was renowned in Dublin City and in Ireland in some aspects for actually having the best music. There was a particular process by which they would import CDs or import vinyls, as it were, CDs, import vinyls from New York and San Francisco from the disco scene. So it was very current sounds that were coming in. So it actually transformed the soundscape of Dublin and didn't just become a space for queer people to go to, but people genuinely wanted to go and listen to really good music. So the Hirschfeld had a monopoly for a number of years until the development of the commercial scene. So we want to speak to people like that. Of course, we want to speak to staff, any number of people who worked in the cafe, who helped clean the seats of the Hirschfeld biograph, who worked pen pushing in the office, or worked the helplines. So we just want to speak to any number of people to capture all the varying experiences that the Hirschfeld had. Earlier, we also discussed, we want to establish what the Hirschfeld did, what it meant to people, but quite crucially, we also want to demonstrate what it wasn't and what it didn't do for people. So in as much as it served the community and in as much as it helped a lot of, gay and lesbian people, the Hirschfeld has been critiqued throughout any academic writings for being a very middle-class, respectable institution that has been predominantly led by gay men. And this is to the obfuscation of lesbians and to a lesser extent, bisexual and trans individuals. So diversity in the Hirschfeld was quite a problem. And that's a problem that we want to engage with directly head on, to not glorify or, yes, the Hirschfeld did have its positive attributes, but it's not an exercise of glorification here. This kind of is a very tenuous history, and queer histories are often about fissures and divides, and we need to acknowledge that rightfully and respectfully and talk about that in the way that's fair. So that's one thing, and I know Maria might want to speak to that in a few moments' time. So from that then, the role of the Hirschfeld in perhaps the national question. At the time, the Troubles were rife in the north, and there were links with members of the Hirschfeld Committee and patrons to sympathizing with the Republican movement. So we want to actually explore those aspects as well. And that's one of many things that we want to look at. The second arm of this is archival research. So Irish Queer Archive actually began in the four walls of the Hirschfeld, and actually some of the documents that you see in the Irish Queer Archive have singed edges from the actual fire, those documents that were saved on the night of the fire in '87. So we want to build on that, and the Hirschfeld is very particular because it's actually spread throughout archives. It's very difficult to corroborate and bring it all together. So for example, one thing we're doing is looking at travel writing in queer international publications to see who was writing about the Hirschfeld from Canada, the US, Australia, throughout Europe, and seeing where it appears in those international contexts. We're also looking to the actual IQA, as we have here, but also the RTE archives, radio archives, and even just activist tapes. We have one such tape that brought famed American writer Edmund White to the Hirschfeld to show him the detritus of the fire and the melted disco ball on the floor, telling him about the history and the activities of the Hirschfeld. So there are lots of ephemeral material that are dotted throughout personal archives, in newspaper archives. So I suppose it's a job for us to try and bring that together. And the intergenerational collaboration, Maria will speak to now.
Thank you, Porrick. So intergenerational collaboration again, a tongue twister, would seem to be a necessity in order for us to collect the stories, listen to the experiences, gather the information across this time period, because we are speaking to people who are entering their senior years, who may have been founders or visited the Hirschfeld, were patrons or staff at the time during the 70s and the 80s. So that is a quite obvious approach, intergenerational collaboration. Porrick is an early career researcher speaking to this longer generational history of queer culture in Ireland. But on another level, intergenerational collaboration is the definition of queer kinship. Because as we know, for many, many years, probably decades, one of the code words for queer identities was whether someone was in the family or not. And we also understand that queer people in Ireland, in Dublin, the world over, have had to form new types of communities and new types of families. So the methodology of intergenerational collaboration is both an obvious one in terms of the historical remit that we're trying to look at with this project, but it is also about how we share history, how we pass down, if that's the right metaphor to use, the stories, how we recapture, even though the archives are ephemeral, and even though history is not progressive, how we capture the moments and the experiences and the voices. So it is a methodology that is central to the project in these several ways.
Thank you, Maria. So from that then, do you want to talk about the podcast and the book then?
Sure. We have three what are again, our academic taskmasters would describe as outputs for this overarching research project called Waking the Hirschfeld. The first, maybe nearest and dearest to my heart, I don't know, Porrick, I don't want to have a favorite, but I may. And this is a limited podcast series that we are entitling Fortress Founds. And this is aimed at literally a physical urban history of the building that the Hirschfeld occupied at number 10 Founds Street. And our idea is that we will revisit, the building is there, it is now being put to very different purpose, primarily commercial, I believe. But we will revisit the experience of being in that building when it was the Hirschfeld with people through the podcast and interview them, have their voices, giving us a sense of what it was like back in the day. The second output is a more conventional book under contract with Liverpool University Press, entitled Disco Liberation. We never get too far away from that glittery disco ball and the spinning of the Flickers disco. Obviously, that's not the only thing that took place in the Hirschfeld, but it was an important key component of what people enjoyed about being there and what people remember about being there. So our question, I think, in the title of the book suggests our thinking about what is the relationship between joy and dancing and queer culture and queer politics and the possibility of liberation. And Porrick, I'll turn back to you to speak about the archive.
So from those two excellent outputs, which we're really excited about, we are particularly excited to collaborate with the National Museum of Ireland, who are our institutional partner with the project. And what we're going to do is, it's really important that the stories that are being told, that, that we're not necessarily being ephemeral with the work that we're doing here, and that we're providing a repository or a space for these stories to be told and retold again. Queer history is all about, revision. It's all about revising. It's all about critiquing. And from that, then we want, and it's very fractured as well and constantly contested. So with that, we want to have an archive where future scholars, future researchers, anyone who's any interest can come and contribute to it, critique it, and take it forward. So the National Museum of Ireland have agreed to make this a home and give a space to the voice, the stories, and the rich history of the Hirschfeld and those who attended it over its run, its decades. So we're very, very happy to collaborate with them on that. And from the outputs then, that brings us to where we're at right now currently. So we are just on the cusp of our launch, and we are literally, speaking of methodologies and whatnot, we are just on the cusp of wrapping up some formal ethical issues, all good, and we are looking to start speaking.
Wait, we should clarify, Pork. What you mean is by ethical issues is that both of our universities ask us to submit copious statements of how we are being ethical in our approach to interviewing potentially vulnerable populations. And it's very serious work. It's very painstaking work. And we are nearly through that process. Just to clarify what the ethical issues, I didn't want that to sound different from what it really is.
A little bit more sinister than I had admitted actually. So yeah, so that is literally all we are waiting on, some final paperwork to ensure that we are being safe and ethical and caring with all the participants sharing their stories with us. So from that, we were looking to start speaking to people over the summer. So if you wish to reach out to be put on a list for us to come back to you at some point, please feel free to do so. We have some of our swag, as it were, here on the screen. And I'd just like to flag that this was developed by Colin Malloy, a fantastic artist, graphic designer, and extraordinaire, it seems, with anything to do with Queer Ireland. He just got the brief completely when we gave him.
Yeah, I have to say, just to confirm that he got it in one. I mean, Porrick and I sent him this kind of very sketchy Word document with some ideas and thoughts, and he came back with this graphic design that is just spectacular.
So he's kind of done graphics for each part of the project. You can see the podcast, the archive, and the actual book itself. And of course, quite central even to the iconography of our branding, if we want to call it that, is the disco ball in the building, just to represent that. So we also have a website, which we haven't formally launched yet, but we can show you here today, just so this is the site by which you can reach out to us. And if any participants want to express any interest in participating in the project, this is the space to do it. It contains all of our details, and I will give you all just a very quick tour of it now. It's wakingthehirschfeld.com, so it's as simple as you can get. And we have our landing page there, and we just have all of the information for the project here, just saying who we are, what we're doing. Again, designed by Colin Malloy fantastically. So if you want to get involved, feel free to come here to schedule an interview. And our details are here at the bottom, where Colin has completely swagged myself and Maria up. So feel free to click on that and send us an expression of interest. We can't begin interviewing just yet, but we would like to start developing a list of people we'd like to reach out to. So that is it, and we will share the link into the chat for those of you who want to have a look at your own pace. But that is everything from us in terms of that. So we are very excited to leave the first stage of the project, I suppose, Maria, and finally get to speaking with people and getting more deep into the archives as we cultivate the very complex, nuanced, and contested history of the Hirschfeld, as it were.
Oh, that was very interesting. Thanks very much, Maria and Porrick. I suppose one question I have from listening to it would be, would you tell me a little bit more about the urban history of the centre in relation to Dublin and Temple Bar?
Porrick, would you like me to start with?
Take that, Maria, go on.
Thank you very much for the question, Dara. As noted when I mentioned not wanting to have a favorite, but slightly having a favorite with the podcast because it focuses on the building for some reason, perhaps because I am a naturalized Irish citizen. Yay, that just happened for me last year. I come originally from the United States. I find myself in Ireland and in Dublin thinking a lot about place. Obviously, many people can do that, but that was something that struck me from early on in the project. And I will say, Porrick was too humble to mention that this whole project really grew out of his PhD dissertation project that I co-supervised on queer representation in Irish media, sort of over roughly this period, 70s, 80s, 90s. And it is now a book, a very excellent book. But so the history that started to emerge as Porrick was doing his dissertation work, it struck me as very interesting because I was trying to imagine the Dublin of the day. Dublin has a very, very storied and important history as an urban center, back to being, the jewel in the crown, if you will, of British colonial cities. So I was struck by what was happening in Dublin and in Temple Bar, which I would know primarily as a slightly kitschy tourism area. Coming to Ireland, for the first time in the 90s and then moving here in 2013. But so what was happening in Temple Bar in the 1970s that this center could be there, given that it was still, gay sex was criminalized and so on. And the history is very, very interesting because it was a place and time where that area of the city was sort of where the bohemian things were happening. It was not considered prime real estate because the city planning had it that it was due to be made into the central bus station. So it was actually going to sort of be obliterated and become, I guess, is it Bucyrus? Is that how that would be pronounced? So landlord, nobody was worried too much about getting high rents or what was going on there. And so there was this kind of free zone. And Tony Walsh, who is the founder of the Irish Queer Archive and someone who gives walking tours of Dublin, queer walking tours, would connect this to a much longer history of that being a sort of zone of libertinism and, sex work and all sorts of those kinds of activities going back historically. So in the 70s, that's where perhaps unsurprisingly, the Hirschfeld Center found itself. Because the fire hit during the late 80s, and there were differences of opinions and controversy within the founders and the people connected to the Hirschfeld about what should happen to it and whether it should continue there. Part of the history of that is related to also real estate and urban development and the idea that then Temple Bar was going to become, initially it was going to be a cultural corridor, and now we know what it has become. And I'm a fan of Temple Bar, so I don't mean to be trashing it, but that's also part of the history. It's part of queer history, but it's also part of Dublin urban history. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but I am
a great answer.
A bit of a Jones on that.
Thanks very much. It was very interesting. Well, that's all the time we have for today. On behalf of us all here at the Little Museum, I want to thank you for taking the time for being with us as part of the Outing the Past Festival. Thanks again to our speakers, Maria Pramaggiore, Professor of Film and Media Studies at Maynooth University, and Pádraig Kerrigan, Assistant Professor at School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. Have a great afternoon. See you later.
Great. Thanks very much.